A rookie cop tossed a 70-year-old veteran for grieving too long at his wife's grave. He didn't know a brotherhood of Marines was on their way to serve their own brand of justice. The October mist clung to the ancient oaks of Oakwood Cemetery, weaving through the headstones like mournful ghosts. It was here, in the cold, damp earth, that Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper had just buried his wife, Margaret. At 70 years old, Roland stood motionless beside the fresh grave, a solitary figure against the gray dawn. He wore his only good suit, a navy blue wool number he'd bought to receive his Bronze Star decades ago. The fabric now hung loosely on a frame made smaller by age and grief, but his military bearing remained, shoulders back, chin up, eyes fixed on the simple stone that bore his wife's name. 43 years. That's how long he'd had with her. He'd been a boy of 19 when he'd enlisted in the army, a boy who thought he was tough. But it was Margaret who had shown him what real strength was. He closed his eyes, and the memories flooded in, a warm current against the tide of his sorrow. He remembered coming home from his second tour, a ghost in his own house, haunted by the things he'd seen. It was Margaret who had sat with him through the long nights, her small hand holding his as he trembled from nightmares he could never speak of. She had been his anchor, his quiet harbor in the storm of his past. He remembered her laughter as they raised their 2 children in the small house he'd built with his own hands after leaving the service. He remembered the pride in her eyes when he taught their son to throw a baseball, and the tears she'd shed when he walked their daughter down the aisle. For 3 years, he had been her caretaker as cancer waged its slow, cruel war on her body. He'd held her hand through every treatment, his own strength drawn from hers. Her last words to him in the sterile quiet of the hospital room were, "You were always the strongest man I ever knew, Rolly." Now, standing over her grave, he felt anything but strong. He felt hollowed out, a building with its foundation ripped away. He didn't know how long he had been standing there. An hour? 2. The funeral had ended, the other mourners had departed, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. In the service, you never, ever left a fallen comrade behind. Margaret hadn't been a soldier, but she had been his battle buddy in the long, hard war of life. He couldn't just walk away and leave her here alone. His quiet vigil was broken by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Officer Danny Morrison approached, his hand resting on his service weapon, his face set in a look of stern importance. At 24 years old and only 8 months on the force, Morrison saw the world as a series of rules waiting to be enforced. The call had come in for a possible vagrant loitering in the cemetery long after the gates had been locked for the night. To Morrison, this wasn't a man grieving, this was a problem to be solved, a box to be checked. He saw the old man in the ill-fitting suit, saw his stillness, and his mind, unburdened by empathy or experience, made a simple, fatally flawed calculation. "Sir," Officer Morrison began, his voice devoid of compassion, a sharp, official sound that sliced through the sacred silence. "The cemetery closed at sunset. You're trespassing on public property." Roland turned slowly, his mind struggling to surface from the depths of his memories. "My wife," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I was just saying goodbye to my wife, Margaret." Morrison glanced at the fresh mound of earth and the wilting flowers, his expression unmoved. "I understand that, sir, but visiting hours are over. Rules are rules. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises now." The cold, bureaucratic tone was like a slap in the face. Roland felt a tremor of disbelief. "Officer, I just buried her this morning. I lost track of time. Can't a man have a moment with his wife?" To Morrison, this wasn't a plea, it was an argument. It was a civilian questioning his authority. His training kicked in, a rigid protocol designed for compliance, not compassion. "Sir, I've given you a lawful order. You need to vacate the property immediately." The finality in the young officer's voice was absolute. Roland, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of grief and exhaustion, felt his legs grow weak. He stumbled back and sank heavily onto a small stone bench near the grave. Just Just 5 more minutes, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Please. In the young officer's rulebook, this was the moment a situation escalated. He saw the act of sitting not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of passive resistance. That's it, Morrison said, his patience gone. He unclipped his radio. Dispatch, I have an uncooperative individual at Oakwood Cemetery refusing lawful orders. Requesting backup. Within minutes, the wail of sirens grew closer, and 2 more patrol cars crunched to a halt on the gravel path. The backup officers, seeing their colleague dealing with an old man who was simply sitting on a bench, seemed confused, but they followed Morrison's lead. They surrounded Roland, their presence large and intimidating. Sir, stand up and place your hands behind your back, one of them commanded. Roland's military training, buried for decades, surfaced. Faced with an order, his body responded before his mind could protest. He moved to comply, but his movements were slow, stiffened by arthritis and weighted down by sorrow. To Officer Morrison, this slow compliance was further defiance. As Roland finally stood, his hands behind his back, Morrison made the decision. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the misty air. The cold steel bit into Roland's thin wrists, and in that moment, something inside his chest broke. He felt a flash of a different kind of cold, a memory from a jungle half a world away, when he'd been a POW for 3 days. The shame and humiliation were identical. As they pushed him toward the patrol car, he stumbled, his legs unsteady. Morrison saw it as an attempt to flee. He's resisting, he shouted, and pulled his taser. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner market just a block from the cemetery, had been taking out her trash when she saw the flashing lights. She recognized Roland immediately. He came in every morning to buy Margaret's favorite flowers. She watched in horror as the officers surrounded the grieving old man. When she saw the handcuffs, she dropped her trash bag and ran inside, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She didn't call the police, she called people who would understand. One of those calls went to Tommy Rodriguez. At 22, Tommy was a Marine corporal, tough as nails but with a deep respect for the generation that had come before him. He knew Roland from the local VFW hall, where the old Army soldier would sometimes share stories. He knew about Margaret's long fight with cancer. He knew today had been her funeral. When Mrs. Chen, her voice frantic, told him that the police were arresting Roland at Margaret's grave, something hot and protective ignited in Tommy's chest. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice deadly calm. He hung up the phone. He looked at his own reflection in the dark screen, a young man in a t-shirt and jeans. This wouldn't do. He walked to his closet and pulled out his dress blues. This wasn't a job for Tommy Rodriguez, it was a job for a United States Marine. As he carefully put on the immaculate uniform, he began making his own phone calls. The message was simple, passed from one Marine to another in the small, tight-knit veteran community. A brother is in trouble. Oakwood Cemetery. Now. The response was immediate. In a small apartment across town, another Marine put down his college textbook. In a house in the suburbs, another excused himself from the dinner table, kissing his wife and telling her he had to go out. 6 other Marines, all from Tommy's unit, all living in the area, all heard the call. They didn't ask why or what for. The only answer they needed was that a brother, a veteran, needed them. Each one of them, in the quiet of their own homes, began the solemn ritual of putting on the uniform that bound them together. It was a uniform that represented not just a branch of service, but a promise that they would never leave one of their own behind, no matter the branch, no matter the war. Back at the cemetery, Officer Morrison felt his control of the situation slipping. A small crowd had gathered at the gates, their cell phones held high. He felt their judgment, their whispered condemnations. His authority was being challenged, and he responded the only way he knew how, with escalation. As Roland stumbled, Morrison shouted, "Stop resisting," and drew his taser. The crackle of 50,000 volts split the night. The electric current seized Roland's frail body, dropping him to his knees beside the patrol car. A sound escaped his throat, not a scream, but a guttural cry of pure, undiluted agony, the sound of a man who had given everything for his country, only to be treated like nothing. That sound carried across the cemetery, reaching the ears of 7 men in immaculate dress blue uniforms who were just stepping through the main gates. When Tommy Rodriguez saw Roland Kemper on the ground, writhing in pain while 3 police officers stood over him, he felt a cold, focused rage settle over him. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a desecration. The 7 Marines did not run or shout. They simply walked, their polished black shoes clicking on the pavement in perfect, unnerving unison. They moved in formation, a river of dark blue and scarlet and gold flowing through the mist-shrouded headstones. Their presence was a silent, powerful rebuke to the chaos and cruelty of the scene before them. Morrison looked up and saw them coming. His jaw went slack. These weren't protesters. These weren't curious bystanders. This was something else entirely. Their eyes, all 7 pairs, were locked on him, and in them, he saw no anger, only a profound, chilling disappointment. Tommy, as the senior enlisted man, halted the formation a respectful 10 feet from the scene. He approached Officer Morrison alone, his posture calm, his authority absolute. "Officer," Tommy said, his voice steady. "My name is Corporal Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. That man on the ground is Sergeant First Class Roland Kemper, United States Army, retired. He is a recipient of the Bronze Star for Valor. Can you please explain to me the tactical necessity of using a taser on a 70-year-old grieving man at his wife's graveside?" The question, so precise and logical, hung in the air. Morrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His entire procedural world had just collided with a world of honor and brotherhood he couldn't comprehend. The other 6 Marines had formed a silent, protective perimeter, not around the officers, but around Roland. They hadn't said a word, but their message was unmistakable: this man is one of ours. He is under our protection now. The arrival of the police supervisor a few minutes later was a formality. He took one look at the scene, the tossed, elderly man on the ground, the stunned officers, the crowd at the gates, and the 7 immaculate Marines standing like statues of righteous anger, and immediately understood the magnitude of the disaster. "Get those handcuffs off him." "Now," he commanded, his voice shaking with fury directed at Morrison. The trespassing charge evaporated into the misty night air. An immediate internal investigation was launched. Morrison's career, just 8 months old, was effectively over. It was Tommy who knelt beside Roland, his gloved hands gently helping the old soldier to sit up. "We've got you, Sergeant," he said softly. Another Marine helped unlock the cuffs. They helped Roland to his feet, not with the rough hands of law enforcement, but with the gentle, steady hands of brothers. His dignity, so violently stripped away, was restored by their simple act of respect. They escorted him back to Margaret's grave. And there, they stood guard, a silent, 7-man honor guard, while Roland Kemper finally finished saying goodbye to his beloved wife, in peace. The story, captured on a dozen cell phones, spread like wildfire. It became a lesson in what can go wrong when authority lacks wisdom, and what can go right when people of honor stand up for what is correct. Roland received hundreds of letters of support, but the only ones that mattered to him were the 7 he wrote by hand, one to each of the young Marines who had answered the call. In each letter, he tried to explain what their presence had meant to an old soldier who thought his days of having brothers in arms were long over. They hadn't just saved him from injustice, they had reminded him that the values he'd fought for, the brotherhood he cherished, were still alive and well. The brotherhood never ends. What does the word brotherhood mean to you, and where have you seen it in action? Share your story in the comments below. Let's celebrate the bonds that unite us. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more.